Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm joined by our youthful Washington correspondent, Daniel Bush. Daniel, are US politicians too old?
Well, that's the question on everyone's mind right now. I appreciate you calling me youthful. We'll get into this a little bit. I am one day younger than the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. So whether or not that's youthful is in the eye of the beholder. But listen, this is age in politics has been in the headlines here in the United States over the weekend with the death of South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, as well as with the long hospitalization of Mitch McConnell. Lindsey Graham was 71. Mitch McConnell is in his mid-80s. This has been a topic now for years in the United States as leaders in both parties have been older. Obviously, age was a major issue for the last president, Joe Biden, who ended up dropping his bid for re-election amid concern over his ability to do the job. The current president, Donald Trump, along with Biden, is only the second U.S. president ever to be 80 in office. So that is the big debate. Our politicians, the leaders in both parties, too many of them, some critics argue, are too old to do the job.
Is this something that matters to voters?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, from one perspective, you could argue that it does not, because voters have now elected multiple presidential candidates who are in their late 70s or even pushing 80. It goes to what the options are for voters, right? And if we take a step back for a minute, the average age of members of Congress in the House is approaching 60. It's a little under 60. The average age of senators is approaching 70. And there are a couple of reasons for that, which I think are important to point out. There are typically two tracks in the U.S. for people who end up in elected office. One is career politicians, and one is people who were not involved in politics and then enter politics later in life. For career politicians, the typical track, again, this is typical, not the case for everyone, is you're working your way up through the ranks, like in any industry, right? So serving on your local city council and then becoming a state senator or assembly person, then running for Congress. And typically, by the time you end up running for Congress, and especially by the time you end up running for the Senate, you've been doing this for decades, which means that you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or even older. And then often, as is the case for people who weren't in elected office to begin with, they built a career in business, in media, and in any other field, and then you end up running, again, in their 40s and 50s. And there are outliers. Joe Biden was the youngest person ever elected to the U.S. Senate in 1972 at the age of 29. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she was one of the youngest members ever elected to the House, now close to a decade ago. But for the most part, by the time that these people enter office or run for high-profile office, they are in their 50s or older, and that's the choice that voters have, and so that's who they put in these positions.
Yeah, and it does tend to be older people who actually go out and vote. Younger people are less likely to vote. I mean, is this a sign that maybe the candidates, being older, are out of touch with younger voters?
This is something that President Obama himself pointed out in an interview just a few days ago, and I'll pull it up here so I can quote from Obama directly. He said, "I'm a pretty healthy 64, that he feels great, but the truth is that he feels that half of the references that his daughters make about social media, he doesn't understand." And then Obama went on to say, quote, "There is an element of at some point you age out." And Obama also said that he wasn't suggesting a sort of hard and fast rule, as he put it, but he did think that Democrats, and again, he's speaking about his party in particular, do well when we have candidates who are plugged into the moment, to the zeitgeist, as Obama put it. So here we have the former president making an argument that at least his party anyway will be better served if they can put forward candidates who are younger, who are more plugged into topics of the moment. Of course, it's easier for him to say that, having gone through and now effectively retired from elected office. He's one of only a half dozen or so Americans in history who entered the presidency under the age of 50. So he's comfortably looking at this in a rearview mirror, if you will. But he was channeling something that I've heard in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for years, covering politics, which is some frustration from voters that older candidates simply aren't with the times, don't understand the issues that matter to them most. And we have a lot of examples where that has really stood out. Certainly the last competitive Democratic primary election, which was 2020, where Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, a lot of the leading candidates were in their 70s or approaching 80. And at times during that campaign season, clearly, showed a generational divide between much younger candidates who are, in some cases, decades younger than them. That's one example. There have also been moments on Capitol Hill recently in the last decade or so where Congress has gotten more serious about trying to regulate technology companies, social media companies, where members of Congress have brought, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world up to the Hill to grill them in testimony, where we've seen these lawmakers talking about technology and clearly struggling to grasp it and understand it. So that the moments like that are a reminder that the people in power in this country oftentimes are, in fact, somewhat out of touch with some of these issues.
And there have been questions where there have been serving presidents and suggestions that they may have dementia. And people have realized that if you do have a president with dementia, it's never been proved while they've been in office. But if you did have a president with dementia, there's very little you could do about it. And to put it crudely, they have their hands on the nuclear button.
That's right. And again, just to use the most recent example, this was an issue that was debated and talked about during Joe Biden's presidency. He entered office in his very late 70s, became the first sitting president over 80 in the Oval Office, and then prepared to run for re-election at the age of 82, which, if he had served a second full term, had he won, would have put him at 86 as he was leaving office. Biden's disastrous debate performance, where he appeared to out of it, he was stumbling, forgetting his train of thought, often was a shock to the nation. A stark example of a president who is older, like many older Americans and people around the world, dealing with the realities of aging. The question is, though, Alex, how much does this actually affect your job? And I think there are two things to say here. On the one hand, politicians they're not manual laborers, right? You can sit comfortably behind a desk. You are flown around the world on government planes, but this is private transportation, right? You're not waiting on long lines at the airport. You have all your needs catered to. Presidents in particular have access to some of the very best healthcare in the world. So the physical side, that part is sort of taken care of, if you will. But these are, emotionally, mentally, psychologically taxing, grueling jobs, whether you're the president or a member of Congress. You are constantly scrutinized every word. You have cameras on you from the moment you step out the door. That part of it is difficult. And of course, public speaking is such a crucial part of the job, whether you're on a debate stage, whether you're giving an interview, making a speech. And when presidents start to slip consistently and show signs of age, as former President Biden did, then it starts a debate about whether or not they can actually perform the duties of their office. And the White House under Biden insisted that he did. And certainly, you could see him in person, sort of sitting there in meetings, seeming to grasp the issues. But then when he stumbled, the question became, what is really happening behind closed doors? And to your point, can he exercise the duties of the office up to and including military issues?
Yeah, US presidents have term limits. How much support might there be in Washington after the cases that you mentioned, maybe for age limits?
It would be a monumental task to actually do that, to change the fundamental principles underlying the way that our government here in the United States is set up. It's highly, highly unlikely that would ever come to pass, in part because once politicians are in office, they like to run for office and hold on to that office, which is why we see, so many senators and members of Congress in particular serving into their 70s, into their 80s. There have been instances in the last decade or two, numerous of people serving even into their 90s. So once people get a hold of power, they don't like to relinquish it. And for that self-serving interest alone, it's highly unlikely that there would be a major change to the way that our government is set up that would limit people from serving more than a couple of consecutive terms.
Some of the biggest names in Washington, you mentioned Mitch McConnell, who's been in hospital, Nancy Pelosi, are reaching the end of their careers. Are there younger people waiting in the wings to take over, to take the big jobs?
That's a very good question. There has been a push more so in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, frankly, for among younger members of Congress to take over those top jobs. These are, both the party leader jobs, the House Majority Leader, the House Speaker, the Senate Majority Minority Leaders, those jobs, as well as the major ranking member or chairperson of the big, most influential committees in Congress that control the power of the purse, that can approve judicial nominations, those kinds of positions. So there is a push, especially on the Democratic side, among some younger members to rise up the ranks a little bit faster. However, the way seniority works, and it's a little complicated and gets into the weeds quickly, those jobs likely go to the next in line. And the next in line in many, many cases are also older politicians, who have been doing this a long time, who've been waiting their turn. So it's unlikely that as Mitch McConnell, who is not running for reelection, Nancy Pelosi also not running for reelection, as some of these major political figures of the 21st century exit the scene, that they'll be sort of immediately overnight wholesale replaced by, the AOCs, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, who are decades and decades younger, but we'll begin to see that shift. Some of those people will get into those positions of power, but it won't likely be sort of an overnight, wholesale change.
Thanks, Daniel. Daniel Bush, our Washington correspondent. If you'd like more from the Global News Podcast, click on the link below. Thanks for watching.